The lantern beam does not reach the back of the cave at first. It falls on ice the color of a deep bruise, that blue you only find where snow has been crushed under its own weight for a very long time, blue that seems to hold light rather than reflect it. The man who is holding the lamp, and it is a paraffin lamp, because the electric torches had frozen solid an hour earlier, takes 3 steps forward across a floor that rings like glass under his boots. His breath hangs in front of him and will not clear. And then the beam slides across something that is not ice, something that has an edge and a shape and a stillness that ice does not have, and he stops. He does not shout. The men who were there said afterward that no one shouted. They said the cave was too quiet to shout in. There is a figure in the wall, not lying down, not curled the way the cold usually leaves a man, knees to the chest, chin tucked, the body trying to become smaller against the end. This one is standing, upright, or very nearly, tilted back a few degrees, as though he had been walking into a hard wind, sealed inside the blue the way an insect is sealed in amber, a hand's width of clear ice between his face and the open air of the cave. And you can see him. That is the part none of the accounts ever get past, the part that made grown men from a hard century go quiet. You can see him completely. The ice did not fog him, or crush him, or tear him. It took him whole, and it kept him. He is dressed to fly. That was the first thing they understood, before they understood anything else, before the questions started that never stopped. A one-piece flight suit, heavy, the kind meant for open cockpits and thin freezing air, the fabric gone stiff and dark inside the ice, but unmistakable in its cut, high collar, deep pockets, a broad belt drawn tight at the waist. Over the head, pushed up but never removed, a leather flying helmet with the ear flaps buckled and goggles shoved onto the brow. And below the goggles, the face. The eyes are open. Let me say that slowly, the way it deserves. The eyes are open, and they are not the sunken, dried, half-shut eyes of a body that died of cold and time. They are full and round, and turned slightly upward and to the side, fixed on some point past the edge of the lamplight, and the expression on the face beneath them is the single detail that no one who saw it could ever file away or forget. It is not peace, it is not sleep. The mouth is drawn, the brow is pulled tight, and one arm, the right arm, is lifted, bent at the elbow, raised across and in front of the face, the gloved hand open and turned outward. The oldest gesture there is. The gesture a person makes without thinking when something too bright or too close or too terrible comes at them out of the dark. A hand thrown up to shield the eyes. He died making it, and the ice caught the making of it, and held the arm exactly there, halfway between his body and whatever he was looking at, for however many years it had been holding him. They did not know how many years. That was the thing that began, right there, to come apart in their hands. Because the closer the lamp came, the more it read like something written in a language that almost made sense and then refused. On the left breast of the flight suit, sewn to the fabric and clear beneath the ice, there was a patch, a squadron patch. The men agreed on that much, because it had the shape of one, the embroidered border, the emblem worked in thread at the center. But the emblem was of nothing any of them could name, not an eagle, not a crest, not the marking of any air service any of them had trained in or fought against or read about, a shape, coiled, and around it lettering, and the lettering did not use their alphabet, and no one in that cave could read a single character of it. And the buckles. A man in flight gear is held together by buckles, at the belt, at the harness, at the throat of the helmet, and every one of them was wrong. Not corroded, not damaged, wrong in design, the wrong geometry, teeth and clasps that did not match the buckle of any parachute harness or safety strap that the expedition's own aviators wore on the very same ice a few miles away. The men who knew aircraft best were the ones most disturbed, because they were the ones who understood exactly what they were looking at and could not place a single piece of it. It was the equipment of a flyer. It was the equipment of no flying service that had ever existed. I have spent a long time with this account, longer than I meant to, and I want to be honest with you about why it holds me. It is not the strangeness on its own. Strangeness is cheap. It is the way the strangeness sits inside a scene so plain and so cold that you can feel the paraffin lamp guttering in the thin air. A body in flight gear, upright in blue ice, at the back of a cave on a coast where, at the moment he was found, powered human flight was younger than some of the men standing over him, and where, by the marks on his own gear, he had somehow flown long before any of it was possible. That is the contradiction the whole story is built on, and everything that came after, the ceiling, the survey stake, the fogged photographs, the two men who would not talk about their dreams, grows out of that first impossible minute in front of the ice. For now, stay in the cave a moment longer. Stand where they stood. Let the lamp shake a little in a cold hand, and watch the light move across him, the raised arm, the open glove, the shielded face, the eyes fixed past you on something you cannot turn around to see, because it is not there anymore, or it never was, or it is only behind you in the dark of a cave that no one has been able to find since. There is a squadron patch that belongs to no squadron. There are buckles that fit no aircraft. There is a face frozen in the act of flinching from a thing that reached him at the far end of the world before the world could have put him there. And there is a small object at his wrist, half turned toward the light, that the man with the lamp had not yet leaned close enough to read. When he did, the last piece of ground the expedition thought it was standing on would go out from under it entirely. So lean close now, the way that man did, and read the wrist. The watch was small, smaller than the field watches the expedition wore, a plain steel case worn thin at the lugs where a strap had rubbed for years before the cold ever touched it. The crystal was intact. That is the first thing the report notes, and it is the thing I keep returning to, because everything around it had cracked, and everything inside it had stopped. But the little curved glass over the dial was whole, and beneath it the hands stood where they had stopped, and beneath the hands there was a date. Not a year printed on a case back. A date, shown through a small window at the edge of the face the way a calendar complication shows the day of the month, and beside it, faint but legible when the lamp was brought close, a set of figures that gave the year. I will not pretend the men in the cave understood at once what they were reading. Cold makes arithmetic slow. But the officer who wrote it down understood it later, at the tent, when he set his own service watch beside the number in his notebook and did the subtraction. The date on the dead man's wrist fell decades before the winter he was standing in. It fell before any aircraft had ever crossed that coast under its own power. It fell, by the plainest reading of the figures, in a year when the machine this airman was so clearly dressed to fly did not yet exist anywhere on Earth, in any shed, on any drawing board, in any nation's dream of the air. The watch had not run down last season. It had run down in a time when the sky over that ice belonged to nothing but weather and birds. You can argue with a watch. A watch can be old, inherited, set wrong, stopped years before its owner died, and never wound again. I have said all of that to myself, in that order, more than once. But a watch does not travel alone on a body, and the body carried other writing, and the other writing agreed with the watch in a way that no amount of argument has been able to pull apart. Go to the mask first. It sat crooked across the lower face, pulled down and to one side as though the last motion of the raised hand had been to drag it off, and it was cracked clean through the hard shell of the cup, a single fracture from the rim to the valve. Oxygen equipment of the kind a man wears to fly high. The expedition men knew flying gear when they saw it. They had it in their own crates. And this was flying gear, unmistakably, in its shape and its purpose, and the way the tube ran up over the shoulder to a fitting at the collar. But it was not their flying gear, and it was not the flying gear of any air service they could name. The valve was of a pattern one of the party, a man who had serviced aero engines in the war, said flatly he had never seen and could not explain. The stitching that held the harness was doubled in a way no maker he knew used. It was the equipment of aviation, built by people who understood breathing at altitude and had solved it, and it belonged to no aviation that had a history. Then the tin, in a pocket of the outer garment, held shut by one of those buckles that fit no aircraft. There was a small, flat ration tin, the kind a man carries against a long cold, and it was stamped. lettering pressed into the metal of the lid and printing on the paper band that still clung to one edge. And the lettering ran the wrong way, not upside down. Not a foreign alphabet, though it was that too, in part. It ran from the right side of the lid toward the left, the characters leaning and closing in a direction that European hands do not write, and European eyes do not read, and yet mixed among the strange characters were shapes the men half recognized, letters that belonged to their own alphabet but stood reversed, as if the whole thing had been printed by someone who had learned to read in a mirror and had never once been corrected. One man held it up to the lamp and turned it over and over, trying to make it resolve into a language, and it would not. It was writing. It was clearly, deliberately writing, the label of a manufactured thing made in quantity by a society with presses and standards and supply. It was simply not writing that came from the world the expedition came from. Read them together now, the way the officer read them at the tent, and feel the ground go. A man dressed to fly. Breathing gear built by people who had mastered the high air. A ration tin mass produced by some organized concern with its own script. And a watch that dated all of it to a year before the first of those things could have existed on this planet. Any one of the objects, alone, you could talk your way past. A patch could be a fake. A buckle could be foreign. A watch could be old. But they were not alone. They were on one body, on one man, and they told one consistent story, and the story was impossible, and it was internally complete. That is the thing that undoes you. Impossible things are usually also incoherent. You catch them because they contradict themselves. This did not contradict itself. It contradicted only the world. He could not have flown. There was no aircraft in that year, on that coast or any other, that could have carried a man over that ice at the altitude his mask was built for. There was no service to issue the patch on his shoulder. There was no factory to press the tin in his pocket. Every document on his body pointed to a flight that history has no room for, and yet he had plainly flown. The gear was worn, not new, worn at the lugs of the watch and the edges of the harness and the seat of the garment, worn the way a thing is worn by a man who used it, who put it on many times, who lived inside the act of flying long enough to leave the marks of it on the leather. He was not a costume set in the ice. He was a working airman who had done the impossible thing so often it had grown shabby on him, and then had come here, to the back of a cave he should never have reached, in a machine that should never have been built, in a year before the idea of it was born, and had raised one hand against something at the last, and stopped. I said the crystal of the watch was whole. I want to add the detail the officer added, in the margin, in a smaller hand, as though he were embarrassed to write it. The second hand, the thin sweep that counts off the running of a live watch, was not resting flat at the bottom of the dial where a stopped watch usually leaves it. It stood partway up the face, held, as if the mechanism had not wound down slowly, but had been arrested in a single instant, caught mid-stride, the way the man himself was caught, arm up, glove open, mid-flinch, in the same held second that the ice had closed over both of them at once. The watch and the man had stopped together. Whatever reached him reached the movement on his wrist in the same breath, and neither of them ever finished the motion they were making. That is what they were still leaning over when the lamp began to gutter for real, and the man holding it understood, before anyone said it aloud, that they could not stay, and could not take him, and could not, in the end, quite bring themselves to leave. So let me take you back out of the cave, back into the light, and tell you how they came to be standing there at all, because the finding was not a discovery so much as an accident of weather, and the men who made it did not go looking for a body. They went looking for a route. The sledge party had detached from the main southern journey on the morning of the 29th, 4 men and 2 dog teams, sent to reconnoiter a line of low blue hills that the aerial survey had photographed the season before and that no one had yet walked. The field notebook of the party leader, a lean, careful man I will call by the initials the roster gives him, R.M., survives in a private collection in Dunedin, and it is the plainest, least excitable document in this whole affair. He records distances in nautical miles. He records the condition of the dogs. He records the wind in the flat vocabulary of a man who has learned not to waste ink. And then, on the 4th page of that day, the tone does not change so much as narrow, the way a voice narrows when a man is trying to describe something without letting himself feel it yet. They had stopped to rest the teams in the lee of the second hill when one of the men, the youngest, a wireless operator only 19 years old, noticed that the snow along a certain seam of the slope was not lying the way snow lies. It was hollowed, faintly, along a line perhaps 40 feet long, sunk in a shallow trough as though something beneath it were breathing cold up through the crust. RM put his bare hand to the seam and felt air moving, not wind. Wind on that coast comes from above and from the side, and it comes with grit in it. This came from below, and it was steady, and it was colder than the day, which on an Antarctic morning is a thing that should not be possible, because nothing down there is colder than the surface air in the open. Cold air sinks. Cold air pools in low places and stays. For air to be rising out of the ground colder than the air already lying on the ground, there had to be a reservoir of older, deeper, stiller cold somewhere beneath their feet, and it had found a throat to leak through. They dug. It took the better part of 2 hours with the light going, and what they opened was not a den or a crevasse, but a fissure, a clean vertical seam in the blue where two masses of ancient ice had drawn apart and never closed, and the seam ran back and down at a shallow angle into the hill. RM.S notebook gives the bearing and the barometric altitude, and then, in the same measured hand, the line that made me read the page a dozen times. He writes that the dogs would not approach the opening. Not that they were reluctant, that they would not. Two teams that had hauled all day toward every hazard the men pointed them at lay down in their traces 40 feet back and put their heads down and would not be moved. And one of the animals, an old lead dog that had wintered twice on the ice, began to make a sound the operator described in his own later statement as neither a bark nor a whine, but a low continuous note, held, the way a man holds a note when he is afraid to stop. RM went in first with the wireless operator and one other, leaving the fourth man with the teams. And here the reconstruction I can offer you leans hard on two documents that do not entirely agree. M.S. Field Notebook, written that same night by Lamp, and the longer account the officer at base wrote days later after he had gone in himself and sealed the place, an account that survives only as a typed copy with the original names removed. What both agree on is the sequence. The passage went back level for perhaps 60 feet, then dropped, then opened into the chamber at the rear, and it was in that chamber, in the blue wall of the far end, that the Lamp found the man with his hand raised. What they disagree on is smaller and stranger. RM wrote that they were inside for 11 minutes. The operator, questioned separately and much later, swore they were inside for over an hour and that RM called the retreat while there was still good oil in the Lamp before it guttered at all, as though the leader had decided something the others had not yet seen. I cannot reconcile those two accounts. I have stopped trying. I only note that both men, writing apart and years apart, felt the need to fix the duration of the thing exactly, as though how long they had stood in that cold had become, for each of them, the most important fact they owned. The officer who came back to seal it arrived 4 days later with a small party and explicit orders, and it is worth being precise about where those orders came from, because this is the point at which the record stops being a story about weather and starts being a story about silence. The expedition operated under a chain of command that ran, on scientific and safety matters, through the senior staff at the main base, and the instruction to close the fissure and mark it as a hazard was issued, on paper, as a routine safety measure, a dangerous ice feature to be flagged and avoided. That is all the surviving order says. It says nothing about a body. The officer drove a standard survey stake into the crest of the seam, a stake of the type used to mark depots and hazards, painted, numbered and logged, and its number appears in the depot register in the ordinary way, filed among 100 other stakes, betraying nothing. Then his party packed the mouth of the fissure with cut snow blocks and left it, and in the official narrative of the expedition, that seam of Blue Hill became a closed hazard with a number and no history. But the two men who had gone in first with RM did not close as cleanly as the cave did. The wireless operator and the third man, the one whose name the typed copy strips out entirely, both touched the ice. I want to be careful here, because this is where the affair tips from record into the thing that records cannot hold. In his own hand, the operator wrote only that he had laid his palm flat against the wall a few inches from the frozen glove, meaning to see, he said, whether the man behind the ice was near the surface or deep, and that his hand had come away and he had not been able to feel it for the rest of the day, a numbness he put down, sensibly, to the cold. The third man reached in further. What we know of him comes second-hand, from a medical orderly at base who noted, weeks later, that the man was not sleeping, and that when he did sleep, he woke the tent, and that he had asked, twice, in daylight and stone sober, whether the officer was quite certain the cave had been sealed on the outside, and not, he said, and then did not finish the sentence, and could not be got to finish it, then or ever after. Both men, back in the wider world, when the expedition was long over and the accounts were being gathered, refused to describe what they had dreamed. Not declined. Refused, actively, one of them walking out of an interview, the other writing a single line to a correspondent who pressed him, that there were things a man saw in ice that did not stay in the ice, and that he would thank him not to ask again. And so the cave, which had held one man for longer than any chart would allow, had reached out in the 11 minutes or the hour it was open and taken hold of two more, and did not, in any way that mattered, ever let them go. I have spent longer trying to find that cave again than the expedition spent in the field, and I want to tell you plainly what happens when you try. You take the survey stake. You take the bearing RM entered in his own notebook, the one that survived because it never went into the sealed crate, a latitude and longitude written in the confident block capitals of a man who trusted his instruments. You lay it over any chart drawn since, and the point falls on water. Not on a glacier that has since retreated, not on a nunatak swallowed by fresh snow, not on a coastline redrawn by better mapping, on open sea. On the modern hydrographic charts, the coordinate sits some distance offshore in water sounded to several hundred meters, a place where no cave has ever been because there is no rock there to hold one, and where the ice that does exist is floating shelf that carves and drifts and cannot keep a fissure open for a season, let alone for the span of a frozen man. There are, I should say, ordinary reasons a 1930s field bearing can miss. Chronometer error throws longitude east or west. A magnetic compass that far south points at nothing you would recognize as north and must be corrected by tables the party may have applied wrongly or not at all. Sledge dead reckoning across featureless ice accumulates error with every mile. I have modeled all of it, the plausible drift of the fix, the cone of uncertainty a careful critic would allow, and I will tell you honestly that the cone is wide enough to pull the point back onto land if you are generous. But here is the thing that keeps me at the desk. RM did not give one bearing. He gave three, taken on three separate approaches, and reduced them against a sun sight, and they agree with one another to within a margin that should have made the position among the most trustworthy the party ever recorded. The man was not lost. By his own careful lights he knew exactly where he was standing when he drove that stake into the mouth of the cave. And the place he knew he was standing does not, on any surface we can now visit, exist, which brings me to the crate. You will remember it was sealed on the officer's order, the plates and the exposed film, packed in the field and not opened, carried north through the whole long return, and lodged, eventually, in an institutional store I have named as precisely as the surviving paperwork lets me. I have read the note written when it was finally opened, years later, by a technician who had no idea what he was looking for and every reason to expect ordinary expedition views. Every plate that had been exposed inside the cave came up fogged. Not damaged, the note is specific. Not scratched, not broken, not obviously light-struck at the edges the way a badly loaded holder fogs. Evenly grey, corner to corner, as though each frame had been held to a soft, diffuse glow for a long time. The plates exposed outside the cave, on the same expedition, from the same boxes, developed clean. Sea ice, dogs, the low sun, men squinting. Only the ones aimed at the airman came back blank, and the technician, who was not a fanciful man and wrote like an accountant, added a single line I have not been able to get out of my head, that the fogging was heaviest at the center of each plate and feathered outward, as if, he wrote, the source had been small and close and directly in front of the lens. Now let me give the skeptic his full say, because he deserves it, and because I have argued his case to myself on the bad nights. Here is the ordinary story, and it is a good one. Antarctic ice makes natural mummies. This is not folklore. It is documented. Bodies desiccated and preserved in cold, dry air for decades, looking eerily fresh. A lost airman from any of the interwar flights, or a sealer, or a castaway from a wreck we never logged, dies in a fissure, freezes upright, is preserved. A sledge party stumbles on him. They are exhausted, oxygen poor, snowblind, primed by weeks of white silence to see meaning in everything, and in that state, a stopped watch becomes a message, and a foreign ration tin becomes a mystery, and the ordinary reversed lettering of a script none of them read becomes writing that runs the wrong way. The fog on the plates is condensation, the classic ruin of cold film brought into a warm tent. The bad dreams are exhaustion and the ordinary horror of having touched a corpse. The coordinates are wrong because field navigation was hard. The seal and the silence are just the Navy being the Navy. Every single element has a flaw under it, and I want you to hear me say that I find this persuasive. On paper, it holds. On paper, it closes the whole thing. And then I put the paper down, and I am left with what the paper does not reach. Condensation fogs film unevenly, and from the edges, where the cold metal of the holder meets the warmer air first. It does not fog heaviest at the center and feather outward from a small close source. Exhaustion invents monsters, yes, but it does not press the same three-bearing fix onto a coordinate that would only later, by charts drawn long after every man on that sledge was dead, turn out to lie over deep water. And exhaustion does not explain the buckles, which I have chased through every catalogue of flight hardware from every nation that ever put a man over that coast, and which match nothing before the encounter, and nothing since. The skeptic explains the men. He explains the fear. He explains, beautifully, why a legend would grow. What he cannot explain is the airman, and the airman is the only thing in this whole account that was ever actually there. So I keep coming back to where we began, to the lantern light finding him at the back of that blue chamber, to the flight gear and the squadron patch that belongs to no squadron, and the watch stopped at a date before any engine had ever carried a man over that ice, and most of all, to the hand, the raised right hand, palm out, held between his face and the mouth of the cave, in the exact posture of a man shielding his eyes from something too bright or too close or too sudden to look at. We have spent this whole account reading him as a body, a record, a puzzle of dates and buckles. But a man does not freeze with his hand up like that by accident, and he does not hold it there for the length of time it takes ice to close around a raised arm, unless, in the last moment he had, there was something in front of him worth shielding against. RM sealed the cave, the charts erased its place, the plates gave back nothing but a small close light. And the airman is still standing at the back of the blue, exactly as the first lantern found him, hand raised against something the ice caught, and we will never see. He was not looking out at the men who found him. He was looking at whatever came in first. And that is the question I cannot put down, the one that has outlasted the crate and the coordinates and the two men who would not describe their dreams. Not who he was, not how he came to be there. But what, at the back of a cave no chart admits, a man in flight gear from no year we can name raised his hand to keep from his face, in the instant before the ice took him, and kept looking in his place.